Hello and welcome to another episode of our story, 250 Years of the United States of America. Boy, do we have a lot to get to today. The Corps of Discovery heads out west and will be retelling the major events recorded in the journals of Lewis, Clark, and a few of the other men on the expedition, as we'll continue to do in tomorrow's episode. Plus, we'll be covering the death of one of the most prominent Federalists, Alexander Hamilton. On top of that, it's an election year, so strap in for a hectic year full of interesting tidbits you don't always find in the history books. Welcome to 1804 in America. It's New Year's Day, and Clark is still training with the Corps of Discovery in Camp Dubois. Records show that the weather is cloudy and cold, with a foot of snow around the camp. Clark also notes that at least 2 of the men are drunk. Despite this, he holds a shooting competition for the men, the top shot getting $1, and continues to trade and purchase food for the journey, which is set to depart in the warmer months. On the 2nd of February, a signer of the Declaration from Georgia passes away. George Walton's exact birthday, or even his birth year, is a fact lost to history. Some research has placed it as early as 1740, others as late as 1749 and 1750. One biographer I've seen makes a convincing case for 1741, but can't definitively prove it. It's fascinating that something like this can be lost to time, and especially bizarre that in all his years of correspondence and personal writings, his age is never mentioned. At least, not in any writings that have thus far been discovered. At any rate, he moved to the province of Georgia in 1769 and entered the office of Henry Young, a barrister in Savannah, with whom he pursued the preparatory studies of the profession of law, and in 1774, when Walton was likely somewhere in his 30s, he was admitted to the bar and began a practice of law. He became a master mason in 1774 as well, and while tensions began ramping up between Great Britain and the colonies, Walton became the secretary for Georgia's Provincial Congress. By 76, Walton left Savannah to attend the Second Continental Congress and was in favor of the proposition for independence, using all his influence to bring about that result. He voted for and signed on the parchment of the Declaration of Independence, and he was re-elected and continued to represent the state of Georgia through 1778. In December of 78, Walton received a colonel's commission in the militia and was present at the surrender of Savannah to the British Army. During the defense of the city of Savannah, Walton was wounded in the thigh, and upon taking that shot fell off his horse and was made a prisoner by the British troops. He was freed in September of 79 during a prisoner swap, and Walton went on to at 6 different times be elected a representative to Congress, twice appointed governor of the state, once as a senator of the United States, and at 4 different periods served as a judge of the superior courts and its chief justice. And it's that office that he has been holding for 15 years, until today, when George Walton, sometime in his mid to late 60s, passes away in his Augusta home in Georgia. Now, on the 15th of February, New Jersey becomes the last northern state to abolish slavery, though as other states, it's not just a out-and-out abolishment. There is a gradual system implemented stating that children born to enslaved mothers after July 4th of this year will be considered free upon reaching a certain age, 21 for females and 25 for males. However, they are required to serve as apprentices to their mothers' enslavers, effectively creating a system of indentured servitude. On the 16th of February, Lieutenant Stephen Decatur is on board a stolen ship disguised as a Maltese vessel flying British colors, and under the ruse of losing an anchor during an overnight storm, Decatur and his crew secures permission from Barbary pirates to moor alongside the USS Philadelphia. He then signals for his men to rush and burn the pirate-held frigate Philadelphia to prevent its usage by the enemy. The daring action is soon reported on back home, and Decatur is lauded as a hero and soon promoted to the rank of captain at just 25 years old. Now, I had to double-check something when I heard about this flying of the false colors, and it turns out that disguising one's ship is in fact legal in warfare internationally, so long as the true flag of a ship is raised before a shot is fired. Back to America and heading down south, with all the needed treaties signed and sealed, in March, a ceremony is conducted over the course of 2 days to demonstrate the transfer of ownership of Louisiana to the United States. On the 9th of March, the new United States Lieutenant Governor of the District of Louisiana and Meriwether Lewis arrive in St. Louis to meet the Spanish Lieutenant Governor for Upper Louisiana, and the Spanish flag that flew over St. Louis for 36 years is lowered, and a new flag is flown, the French tricolor. This is a symbol of the land changing hands through Napoleon, because he had secured the lands in 1800 with a deal that was largely kept under wraps and only recently became public knowledge. This French flag only stays up for around 24 hours, and on March 10th, this French flag is lowered, and a 15-star, 15-stripe American flag is raised in its stead. This ceremony is remembered now, quite fittingly, as the Ceremony of Three Flags. It is worth clarifying that this ceremony is just that. The United States took formal possession of Louisiana on December 20th of 1803. Just over 2 weeks later, after a lengthy debate in the House and Senate, a law is signed by President Jefferson, an act directing Louisiana into 2 territories and providing for the temporary government thereof. And the goal with this legislation is largely to aid in the management of this vast territory by dividing the heavily populated southern area from the mostly empty north. Now, on March 12th, we get to a story that needs a little bit of explaining before we get into it. We've already touched on some of the key points that you'll need to remember. The Alien Sedition Acts of 98, the Judiciary Act of 1801 and its subsequent repeal, and Jefferson's attempt to purge hyper-partisan Federalists from the government writ large since his taking office as the first Republican president. At the urging of President Thomas Jefferson, a representative in Congress from Virginia orchestrates impeachment proceedings against Samuel Chase, a judge serving on the Supreme Court of the United States. Chase is accused of refusing to dismiss biased jurors, as in the case of John Fries, who was convicted of treason by jury and who had amongst his ranks in the jury one man who reportedly expressed a desire to see Fries hang before the trial began. Chase is also accused of excluding or limiting defense witnesses in a trial stemming from the Sedition Acts that were used to silence Republicans in the lead-up to the election of 1800. Furthermore, and as some may argue is the real reason for his particular notoriety to Jefferson, Chase criticized the repeal of the 1801 Judiciary Act in court to a grand jury. While the proceedings are slow, today, March 12th, the votes are counted and the U.S. House of Representatives is in favor of commencing impeachment proceedings against Samuel Chase so that he may be tried for high crimes and misdemeanors. The same day, March 12th, a judge's service is terminated after a successful impeachment last year and conviction this year. The district court judge for the District of New Hampshire, John Pickering, is removed from his position for misconduct as a judge and for intoxication. A much more cut-and-dry case, though even this 19-9 vote is one that follows party lines. News reports from the time claim that Pickering showed signs of mental illness while he was on the bench, and that his impeachment stemmed from accusations of smuggling, political favoritism, greed, drunkenness, and insanity. It's now May 14th of 1804, and We should just take a moment before we begin telling the story of Lewis and Clark here in earnest and realize how difficult this mission really is going to be from at least our perspective. With only the most rudimentary maps made largely off of speculation, Lewis and Clark are about to co-captain a journey up unexplored rivers looking for a passage to the Pacific Ocean. No survey maps, no Google Maps for sure. They're using a sextant to map their location based off of stars and using a compass in day-to-day travels to make sure they're going the correct way. The correct way is somewhat of a misnomer as they're forging the way. We know they'll be heading up the Missouri and eventually hitting the Rocky Mountains where it's theorized the other side of the mountains will have a river going towards the Pacific. In reality, and as history will show, it's not quite that easy. The picture of this small group of men heading out into the unknown and exploring so that everybody can benefit from their discoveries is one that's integrally American. Everybody knows their names, everybody has a general idea of the story, I believe, but what we're going to be doing over the next couple episodes is going as deep as we can into their journals and providing some details from the men who were actually there in their own words. I've got about 10,000 words written, and the details that I have recorded here are not always mentioned. There's the standoff with the Indian tribes, the time Lewis got shot, and a few other surprises along the way. Anyway, back to May 14th, where the Corps of Discovery embarks from Camp Dubois outside of St. Louis, Missouri in a 55-foot keelboat to begin the westward journey up the Missouri River with the conspicuous absence of Meriwether Lewis, who's still in St. Louis getting the last of the expedition's supplies together. By the 16th, Clark and the Corps has made it 24 miles upstream, where they wait in St. Charles for Lewis. Lewis catches up with Clark and the Corps on the 20th, and the next day, the United Corps sets out together for the first time. The United States Secretary of War has denied Lewis' requests for a shared command of the journey, but Captain Lewis and Lieutenant Clark choose to address one another as captain to hide this fact from the other members of the expedition, and even refer to themselves in their journals as co-captains. As such, I will be continuing to call Clark a captain, not a lieutenant. Among the 41-man crew of volunteers overseen by Captain Lewis and Captain Clark are soldiers, one black slave, and Patrick Gass, a carpenter from Pennsylvania. Gass writes in his journal about the expected dangers ahead, saying, "The best authenticated accounts informed us that we were here to pass through a country possessed by numerous powerful and warlike nations of savages, of gigantic stature, fierce, treacherous, and cruel, and particularly hostile to white men, and fame had united with tradition in opposing mountains to their course, which human enterprise and exertion would attempt in vain to pass. The determined and resolute character, however, of the Corps, and the confidence which pervaded all ranks dispelled every emotion of fear and anxiety for the present, while a sense of duty and of the honor which would attend the completion of the object of the expedition, a wish to gratify the expectations of the government and our fellow citizens, with the feelings which novelty and discovery inevitably inspire, seemed to ensure to us ample support in our future toils, suffering, and dangers." Just 2 days into their journey, they stopped to greet a crowd of well-wishers. From the journal of Lewis, "Stopped 1 hour where there was many people assembled to see us. Halted at an indented part of a rock which jutted over the water, called by the French the tavern, which is a cave 40 yards long, with the river 4 feet deep and around 20 feet high. This is a place the Indians and French pay homage to. Many names are wrote up on the rock, mine among others. At 1 mile above this rock comes a small creek called Tavern Creek, above one other small creek. Camped at 6 o'clock. The journey nearly meets with an early tragedy here as Lewis is climbing the rocks and barely avoids a mortal fall. From the journal of Clark, Captain Lewis near falling from the peninsula of rocks 300 feet. He caught at 20. The men do a stocktake of their ammunition and kill a deer before sleeping the night. By the 25th, the Corps makes their way past La Charrette, which is the last white settlement on the Missouri River, and from here on out, they are in unsettled American territory. On the 3rd of June, Lewis and Clark name their first geographical feature that is as of yet unrecorded in American maps. From Clark, "We made other observations in the evening after the return of Captain Lewis from a walk of 3 or 4 miles round. We set out at 5 o'clock p.m., proceeded on 5 miles to the mouth of a creek on the left side, 20 yards wide, called Murrow. Passed a creek at 3 miles, which I call Cupboard Creek, as it mouths above a rock of that appearance. Several deer killed today. At the mouth of Murrow Creek, I saw much sign of war parties of Indians having crossed from the mouth of this creek. I have a bad cold with a sore throat." On the 7th of June, Clark records seeing several curious paintings and carving in the projecting rock of limestone inlaid with white, red, and blue flint of very good quality. The Indians have taken of this flint great quantities. We landed at this inscription and found it a den of rattlesnakes. We had not landed 3 minutes before 3 very large snakes were observed on the crevices of the rocks and killed. Alright, now heading back to civilization, on June 15th, the 12th Amendment of the United States Constitution is ratified by New Hampshire and meets the required 3/4 majority of states' approval, and, arguably, becomes effective, though approval is subsequently vetoed by the governor, placing the amendment in a position to be disputed. The veto itself is actually disputed as well, as governors do not have the constitutional authority to veto constitutional amendment ratifications. This amendment reads, "The electors shall meet in their respective states and vote by ballot for president and vice president, one of whom at least shall not be an inhabitant of the same state with themselves. They shall name in their ballots the person voted for as president, and in distinct ballots the person voted for as vice president, and they shall make distinct lists of all persons voted for as president, and of all persons voted for as vice president, and of the number of votes for each, which lists they shall sign and certify, and transmit sealed to the seat of the government of the United States, directed to the President of the Senate. The President of the Senate shall, in the presence of the Senate and House of Representatives, open all the certificates, and the votes shall then be counted. The person having the greatest number of votes for president shall be the president. If such number be a majority of the whole number of electors appointed, and if no person have such majority, then from the persons having the highest numbers not exceeding 3 on the list of those voted for as president, the House of Representatives shall choose immediately by ballot the president. But in choosing the president, the votes shall be taken by states, the representation from each state having 1 vote. A quorum for this purpose shall consist of a member or members from 2/3 of the states, and a majority of all the states shall be necessary to a choice. And if the House of Representatives shall not choose a president whenever the right of choice shall devolve upon them, before the 4th day of March next following, then the vice president shall act as president, as in case of the death or other constitutional disability of the president. The person having the greatest number of votes as vice president shall be the vice president, if such number be a majority of the whole number of electors appointed, and if no person have a majority, then from the 2 highest numbers on the list the Senate shall choose the vice president. A quorum for the purpose shall consist of 2/3 of the whole number of senators, and a majority of the whole number shall be necessary to a choice. But no person constitutionally ineligible to the office of president shall be eligible to that of vice president of the United States." So before this amendment, the Electoral College system had electors cast 2 votes for president, The candidate with the most votes would become the president, and the runner-up would become the vice president. And this led to that deadlock in Congress in 1801, which, it's hoped, can be avoided by this new amendment. We'll catch back up with Lewis and Clark on the 26th of June, where the Corps reaches the mouth of the Kansas River, meaning that they've covered over 360 miles since their departure in mid-May. In a nice little first, on July 4th, the first celebration of independence west of the Mississippi is observed. Again, from Clark, we'll hear, July 4th, Wednesday, 1804. Set out early. Past the mouth of a bayou leading from a lake on the south side. This lake is large and was once the bend of the river. It reaches parallel for several miles. Came to on the left side to dine and rest a short time. A snake bit Joe Fields on the side of his foot, which swelled much. Apply barks to the wound. Pass a creek on the left side about 15 yards wide coming out of an extensive prairie. As this creek has no name, and this day is the 4th of July, we name this Independence United States Creek. He continues on in his journal entry describing the land almost poetically. The plains of this country are covered with a leek green grass, well calculated for the sweetest and most nourishing hay, interspersed with crops of trees spreading their lofty branches over pool springs or brooks of fine water. Groups of shrubs covered with the most delicious fruit is to be seen in every direction, and nature appears to have exerted herself to beautify the scenery by the variety of flowers, delicately and highly flavored, raised above the grass, which strikes and perfumes the sensation and amuses the mind, throws it into conjecturing the causes of so magnificent a scenery, in a country thus situated far removed from the civilized world to be enjoyed by nothing but the buffalo, elk, deer, and bear, in which it abounds, and savage Indians. We'll head back east on July 11th, and for this next story, we'll discuss the Vice President Aaron Burr. He grew up studying theology, but as the political climate began to shift in the lead up to the Revolution, he shifted his studies to law before finally leaving his studies entirely to become a soldier. He participated in the American invasion of Canada, serving under Benedict Arnold, which we ever so briefly mentioned in the preamble of this series, and was one of many crucial leaders in the American retreat from New York. After he was promoted to lieutenant colonel, Burr fought off raids into New Jersey by the British and defended a pass into Valley Forge during the winter of 77 to 78. After the defeat at the Battle of Monmouth and mounting health problems, Burr resigned from the Continental Army in 1779, at which point he completed his legal studies before entering politics and eventually became a senator for New York in 91. He ran for president in 96 and placed fourth, again something that we covered, and then ran again in 1800, and as was a point of major contention, tied Jefferson with 73 votes, eventually being selected by the House of Representatives to be the vice president. Already, Jefferson is the popular choice for the Republicans in this year's election. His actions during these first 4 years have cemented his approval, and he has recently made it clear that Burr will not be his running mate again. Burr has, in response, turned his ambitions to running for governor of New York. However, Alexander Hamilton and fellow Federalists have mounted a vicious campaign against Burr, even publishing Hamilton's private remarks in which he said he believed Mr. Burr to be a dangerous man and one who ought not be trusted with the reins of government. After Burr read the remarks of his longtime rival, he sent a series of letters to Hamilton, eventually issuing a demand for satisfaction. I've seen it reported that Hamilton wanted to avoid the duel, but even if he did, politics left him no choice. Hamilton accepted the challenge, and now, on the morning of July 11th, the two longtime rivals meet in the heights of Weehawken, New Jersey for a duel. Much has been said and written about the duel, and History is still ambiguous on who shot first, whether Hamilton intended to waste his shot, and even who stood facing which direction. However, what is clear from all accounts is that 2 shots were fired. Hamilton missed, Burr did not. Burr's shot entered Hamilton above his right hip, injuring his liver and spine. Hamilton dies the next day. If Burr was hoping the duel would secure his political career, he was sorely mistaken. It promptly ends it, and New York and New Jersey charged the sitting vice president with murder. As Hamilton is neither a signer of the Declaration nor a president, we won't fully recount his life here, though many of his major accomplishments we have covered since he was 21 in 76 and joined Washington's army. His influence on America's early financial systems is really hard to overstate, and his influence amongst Federalists has been unmatched. The inscription on the tombstone for Alexander Hamilton reads, "To the memory of Alexander Hamilton, the Corporation of Trinity Church has erected this monument in testimony of their respect for the patriot of incorruptible integrity, the soldier of approved valor, the statesman of consummate wisdom, whose talents and virtues will be admired by grateful posterity long after this marble shall have moldered into dust. He died July 12, 1804, aged 47. In a slight tangent that I found when looking into this, the stone bearing that inscription actually had been neglected for decades and grown over with moss and been pretty severely weathered. It was relatively recently restored, however, the legacy of Alexander Hamilton has been alive and well ever since his joining of the Continental Army. As for Burr, he's certainly not exiting our story anytime soon. Hamilton has always felt that he was dangerous. The public now resents him, and Jefferson drops him. Soon, a dejected Burr will take extreme actions that take years to come to even the president's attention, but that's a story for another time. However, I will say that on the 20th of July, the Vice President Aaron Burr contacts Charles Biddle, a cousin by marriage to a man we have not yet met, named James Wilkinson, by encrypted letter. You can view that letter on our X today. The very same day that he is penning this letter, a grand jury in New Jersey and the coroner's jury in New York City are considering charges against him for the murder of Alexander Hamilton. Briefly, on the 21st of July, the Corps of Discovery reaches another milestone, camping at the mouth of the Platte River, now 630 miles from their starting location. On the 27th of July, the 12th Amendment to the United States Constitution is ratified by Tennessee, removing any doubt surrounding adoption and securing its implementation well before the first votes are to be cast in this new election. Alright, so we're going to head out west now and stick with Lewis and Clark for a while. On August 3rd, the Corps of Discovery has an important parlay as they meet with the Otoe and Missouri Indian chiefs and hand out peace medals. In a speech made to these Indians, Lewis and Clark attempt to foster goodwill by referring to the tribes as the children of the fathers from the West and explaining the new acquisition of land made by the Americans. Clark explains the meeting, delivering a speech informing those children of ours of the change which had taken place, the wishes of our government to cultivate friendship and good understanding, the method of have good advice and some directions. Each chief and principal man delivered a speech acknowledging their approbation to what they had heard and promised to pursue the good advice and caution. They were happy with their new fathers who gave good advice and to be depended on, all concluded by asking a little powder and a drop of milk. I answered those speeches, gave them 50 balls, 1 canister of powder, and a dram. After Captain Lewis shot his air gun a few times, which astonished the natives, we set sail. On August 20th, Sergeant Charles Floyd, the youngest man on the expedition, falls ill and dies of what is suspected to be a ruptured appendix. Remarkably, He is the only man who will die on this entire journey. Now, skipping ahead a little bit, on September 23rd, we enter the most sensitive chapter of diplomatic attempts made by Lewis and Clark. The Corps of Discovery is resting at the camp just below the mouth of the Bad River, when 3 Sioux boys swim across the Missouri to greet the explorers. When the Sioux boys tell Lewis of 2 villages just up the river, his suspicions are confirmed that they are from the Teton Sioux villages. The Teton Sioux have earned a reputation well known by St. Louis merchants of harassing traders and demanding large gifts to secure passage. Of all of Lewis and Clark's encounters with Indian tribes, the meeting with the Teton Sioux, or the Lakota, is among the most tense. Jefferson, you'll remember, has tasked the Corps with Indian diplomacy, which consists mainly of announcing the Louisiana Purchase and presenting tribal chiefs with peace medals and American flags. As is often quoted, Jefferson gave orders to make a friendly impression. One major hiccup is the allegiance of these Indians to the British, as there is a decades-long alliance formed through the trading of furs that has proved to be mutually beneficial. These Tetons are often cited as the best beaver hunters known in North America. The meeting of these boys prompts preparations for a diplomatic council after breaking camp on Monday morning. Lewis and Clark select gifts, including flags, medals, and a military coat and hat for the chiefs, while also readying arms for potential conflict. I have opted to summarize myself rather than quote directly, as the journal entries, as I'm sure you can tell from those I have quoted, are pretty stilted, and I'd like to build some tension here. On the 25th, the main diplomatic council takes place on a sandbar in the Bad River. Lewis relies on Pierre Cruzat, who speaks limited Sioux, making it difficult to effectively communicate. Communication breakdowns are common during the expedition, given that Lewis and Clark often rely on a 3-way translation, from whichever Indian language they happen to be speaking, then to French, then to English, and then back to French to the Indian language in order to communicate. Sometimes they'll use sign language to try to converse with these chiefs, but they often have their own political agendas, and in hostile negotiations, this lack of clear communication only makes things more difficult. Lewis makes a short speech, then goes on to put on their practiced demonstration of martial power and Western technology. The performance begins with a military parade, followed by Lewis presenting the coat, hat, and medal to the leading chief, Black Buffalo, but he is interrupted. The 2 lower chiefs next to Black Buffalo begin to complain that the gifts are inadequate, and it seems that Lewis slighted them by focusing only on one of the 3 leaders. Looking to smooth things over, the chief referred to as the partisan and a few of his men are invited to tour the keelboat. But when he gets out there, he feigns drunkenness from the quarter cup of whiskey that the men have presented, gets rowdy, and tries to provoke a confrontation as Clark and a few men return him to the shore. Once they land their canoe on the shore, the warriors seize the cable, tethering the canoe to the shore, and the chief speaks harshly to Clark, staggers up against him, and tells him that the expedition cannot advance. These actions are meant to encourage Clark to yield, but he instead draws his sword and alerts Lewis and the crew still on the keelboat to prepare for action if need be. Lewis orders the swivel guns mounted on the boat to be trained on the Indians, while the soldiers around Clark prepare their weapons. It's because of this that the chief Black Buffalo steps in and orders the warriors away from the boat's cable, though instead of letting it go, he takes control of the cable and also confronts Clark while his warriors string their bows. Black Buffalo declares that he has warriors, and if the Corps wants to head out, they will be followed and they will be killed. Clark later writes that he felt himself get warm and spoke in very positive terms, reminding the chief that the expedition was sent by the chief of the 17 Fires. a common Indian term for the President of the United States, whose warriors could be summoned in a moment to punish the Sioux, and he boasts that he has enough power to kill his nation 20 times over. It's about this time that another canoe filled with 12 American soldiers ready to fight lands on the shore. Most of the Indians retreat, leaving Clark alone with the chiefs and a smaller corps of warriors. Black Buffalo, still holding the cable to the canoe, asks if the women and children might see the keelboat and its curiosities. This is an easy request to grant for Clark, and he hopes it's one that will allow both sides to emerge with their honor and prestige intact, so Clark agrees, and Black Buffalo finally drops the cable. The chief says that he is sorry to have the men go, for his women and children are naked and poor, and he wishes to get some goods, but he does not think that the Corps is merchants, nor that they were loaded with goods, and after this tense engagement, the chiefs have a private council, and after waiting some time, Clark approaches the chiefs and offers to shake hands, but he's rebuffed, and takes it as a signal that discussions are well and truly over for the day. As Clark and his party paddle back to the keelboat, Black Buffalo makes one last demand. He and 2 of his warriors wade out 10 feet from the shore and ask to be taken on board the keelboat. That night, the chief and his men sleep on board, and Clark writes simply of the day, "Their treatment to me was very rough, and I think justified roughness on my part." The roughness of the day was hardly what Jefferson had in mind by a friendly impression. The next day, Black Buffalo asks the captains to land near his village so his women and children might visit the boat, and Lewis and Clark agree. Clark notes that the chief appears to be disposed to make up and be friendly, and Lewis is invited into the village where a feast is prepared, a notable change of tactics from the day prior. Overtures are made to the Corps to stay another night, and Lewis agrees. That night, a ceremony is arranged in which the chief takes a pipe and offers a prayer, then takes dog meat and makes a sacrifice to the flag of the United States. After a feast and some dancing, the chiefs again sleep on the keelboat, and as Lewis and Clark leave the village, Clark is offered young women as partners. A common gesture of both diplomatic and spiritual significance to many of the tribes that the Corps encounters, as it's seen as a way of transferring power from a strong warrior to a tribe. Although aware of the symbolic significance of intercourse with the girl offered to him, Clark dismisses her, and it's likely that this refusal strains an already delicate relationship. We won't discuss it in any detail, but across the mission, many of the men of the Corps of Discovery are not as principled as Clark and do not object to the women that they are offered. On Thursday morning, September 27th, both the captains and the chiefs are up early. Black Buffalo and the Partisan are given, or rather they simply take, the blankets that they had slept on, and after breakfast, Lewis and the chiefs head to shore as hundreds come to see the expedition. Lewis and Clark and their men have now been with the Teton Sioux for 3 days, and again spend the night with a chief sleeping on the keelboat, though the night is a chaotic one as the men's boat loses its anchor, and the commotion startles the chief, who raises the alarm to his men on shore before eventually the situation is diffused. Much of Friday morning is spent in a fruitless search for the keelboat anchor. Then, by mid-morning, the work parties take breakfast and hundreds of villagers line the bank again to view the expedition. As the captains are about to order the sail hoisted, Black Buffalo and the other chiefs appear and begin their now familiar demand that the expedition remain with them. But despite the request, the crew makes preparations to cast off the bowline. At that very moment, several warriors take hold of the cable on shore, evidently fearing that the seizure of the cable spells the beginning of possibly very serious trouble, and possibly, from some later accounts, feeling resentment that the Partisan had stepped into the whole affair. Chief Black Buffalo hurries forward to assure Lewis that the warriors simply want tobacco. Lewis is weary of the constant demands for gifts and refuses to give them anything. He orders all hands ready for departure, has the sail hoisted, and orders one of his men to untie the cable. At this critical moment, several things happen at once. The cable is untied by a crewman, was again fastened by several of the Indian warriors, and at the same time, the partisan demands a flag and some tobacco. Lewis angrily orders all the Indians off the boat, while Clark throws tobacco on the bank, and Black Buffalo himself jerks the cable from the warrior's hand and lets go. With that, the Teton-Sioux confrontation is over, with talks having largely failed. The Sioux are no closer to becoming part of the St. Louis trade network, and if anything, may be further from it, and no delegation of dignitaries is prepared to meet the president, as was the hope in the case of successful talks. In regards to further Indian relations, though this time in the East, the Treaty of St. Louis is signed by Quashquame and William Henry Harrison. The treaty is, like most, signed under dubious circumstances. It's claimed that the Sauk hunters have murdered and scalped 3 or 4 American settlers who entered Sauk territory near the Missouri River. And while the Sauk chiefs denounce the murders as they are fearful of American retaliation, American officials send a message to the Sauk demanding that they surrender the murderers for trial and invite them to negotiate a solution to the murders. The Sauk Tribal Council responds by sending a delegation of 5 chiefs to St. Louis, led by Sauk Chief Quashquame. 1 or more members of this delegation were also Meskwaki Indians. The Tribal Council has instructed the delegation to resolve the issue of the murders, and the negotiation leads to this treaty in which it is agreed upon that the Americans will claim some 50 million acres of land bordering the Mississippi in exchange for a one-time payment of about $2,300 and an annual payment of $1,000 to be split between the 2 tribes, the Sauk and the Meskwaki. While a valuable acquisition for the United States, the tribal leaders will later dispute the treaty, and lingering resentments over the deal will splinter allegiances in the near future, in a major story that we'll be covering next week. Alright, now back to Lewis and Clark for one final update of this year. Winter is fast approaching, and the Corps constructs Fort Mandan in what is now North Dakota, among the hospitable Mandan and Hidatsa Indians. It is here that they meet Touchant Charbonneau, a French-Canadian fur trader living with the Hidatsa. On November 11th, Clark makes a hasty scribble in his journal about the arrival of 2 squaws of the Rock Mountain purchased from the Indians by a Frenchman. One of these nameless women is now the famous Sacagawea. Now, real quick, the pronunciation I just used and will continue to use is not all that common unless you're also deep down this rabbit hole. Reading from the Columbia Gorge Museum's website, I will explain the reason for this briefly. Lewis and Clark's tendency to use variant and inconsistent spellings in their journals is well known, if not legendary. In recording the name of the Shoshone woman who accompanied the expedition, they used at least 8 different phonetic spellings of her name, such as Sacagawea, or Sacagawea, or Sakagarwea. In one respect, they are all consistent in indicating that the 3rd syllable is always pronounced with a hard G. This is one of several reasons for the current preference among nearly all historian scholars for the spelling Sacagawea, as opposed to the more popularized Sacagawea. Alright, so it may take some getting used to, and I'm far from perfect in my pronunciations, but if I can be more accurate than pop history I always try to be, so there you go. Sacagawea. Now back to the story. In the end, both Sacagawea and Charbonneau will join the expedition, and the couple proves invaluable to future communications. Sacagawea is already pregnant at this time, and joins despite this added difficulty in the expedition that lays ahead. To the Corps, having a woman, and soon a small baby, is another helpful tool in diplomacy, as their party's arrival at various tribes is more likely to be seen as peaceful with the addition of this mother and her small child. Construction continues on the fort, and from Gass we get a good description of their winter camp, which is also pictured on our X today. The huts were in 2 rows containing 4 rooms each and joined at one end forming an angle. When raised about 7 feet high, a floor of puncheons or split plank were laid, and covered with grass and clay, which made a warm loft. The upper part projected a foot over, and the roofs were made shed fashion, rising from the inner side, and making the outer wall about 18 feet high. The part not enclosed by huts we intended to picket. In the angle formed by the 2 rows of huts, we built 2 rooms for holding our provisions and stores. So this is where the Corps of Discovery will winter until we'll pick back up with them in 1805. Now on November 30th, the Democratic-Republican-controlled United States Senate, against the Federalist partisan, Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, Samuel Chase. He is charged with political bias, but will later be acquitted by the Senate. Normally, in an election year, we'll be discussing the campaign and race between the candidates most likely to win, but this year we've largely omitted doing so. As Jefferson has proved to be extremely popular with the people, the Federalists' power is waning, and through the wealth created through tariffs and by practicing strict fiscal responsibility, Jefferson has become largely well-liked. He is the first president to not have major tax increases domestically under his administration, thus avoiding any notable protests, and by acquiring the Louisiana Territory, he has cemented his popularity as many Americans look westward for cheaper land, more favorable growing conditions, and a better life. His current vice president, however, has lost favor with nearly everyone, including Jefferson, and is currently hatching a plan in the shadows that we'll hint at next year but won't fully discuss until 1807. On December 3rd, Thomas Jefferson defeats Charles Pinckney in what is to this day the highest victory margin in a presidential election in which there were multiple party candidates, the qualifier only being necessary due to Washington's consecutive unanimous victories in the first 2 presidential elections. Jefferson takes it 162-14, with Ohio's recent addition raising the total votes cast since the last election, and Jefferson handily secures his re-election after a highly contentious first election in 1801. Well, that's all that I've got for this year. Jefferson is re-elected to maintain his presidential administration, and we'll cover his inauguration on the 4th with a new vice president, a man we've talked about in detail, George Clinton. We'll continue covering the events of the Corps of Discovery and provide a few other updates throughout the year. If you're enjoying the show, take a moment to share it with somebody that you know. We're going through American history every single day until America's 250th anniversary, at which point you can listen to all 250 episodes. Until next time, this has been Our Story, 250 Years of the United States of America, and as always, thanks for listening.